Thank you very much for coming. Nick asked me to make sure that when I talk about historic cities, I don't only talk about Oxford. That's why I'm going to talk about cycling, because it's the only thing I've got which links to the other historic cities. Before I start, I should give the two reasons why I'm going to say what I'm about to say. One is that for many people in Oxford, Oxford is quite a miserable place. It doesn't start off a miserable place. They turn up, they really like it, the rent is very high, it's exciting. And then 3, 4, 5 years later they have to leave because they can't afford to stay here. It's a city of very high turnover. If you do a snapshot, you won't get that degree of upsetness because, of course, these people are always leaving. Often, I think, quite shortly after they realise that they can't stay. But if you were to be able to survey all the people who'd lived in Oxford in the last 10 or 20 years, you would get a very different story about this city. But the second reason for why I'm going to say, which is really about how can you improve the city, how can you get more housing, is the complaint that Liam Fox made the other day. I'm not worried about our business people playing golf too much. It's about our exports. As a country, the United Kingdom has a very high deficit between what we export and what we import. If we want to carry on importing, we are going to have to sell more things abroad. We've already reduced the value of the pound by 20%, so we are going to be buying less fridges and less TVs, but we probably want to carry on getting these things, and so we have to sell people abroad something. Currently, we sell missiles to the Saudis which are fired in the Yemen, I think at roughly the same price as we might charge a young person from China to come and do a master's course here. My preference would be that we sell Saudi Arabia less missiles made outside of Bristol and take more master's students, but there has to be space for them. Or 1% of our manufacturing exports in this country are the Mini car. Quite an efficient car, fairly green car, could get more efficient. It's made in Cowley. We either carry on doing that or do more of it, or one of our bankers in London has to sell some dodgy derivative product to somebody from abroad and rip them off. And again, I would rather that we build small cars through BMW than we do the other ways in which we can make money. Now, not all of it needs to be done in historic cities, but there is a reason why BMW wanted to be here, and that reason has 6 letters, and it's the word Oxford. I think you can use the history of these cities to work out a sensible way of expanding them. Before we got into cars, William Morris was into bikes, is what that slide says. And this map, has anybody shown it already today? First time? This is a historic map. So this is a historic plan. This is the 1927 plan for the expansion of Oxford. It's a circular Oxford because back in 1927 most people walked or cycled to work. And so you didn't want people living a long way away. And you weren't making provisions for cars because most people couldn't afford cars. When I was growing up in this city, I used to have to wait every day to cross the road to get to school because of the thousands of men cycling from Barton to the car works on bikes. So that is the area designated for expansion in 1927. That was what was killed off by the University of Oxford and by the elite of the town. That's why we have the 7 protected views, only 3 of which you can actually see. It's not all sensible to develop because, of course, more areas flood than they knew back in 1927. The green area is what they thought flooded. It's great that areas flood in Oxford because you get a natural Greenbelt, which you would be stupid, I think, to touch. But it is an artificially constrained city, deliberately through planning to constrain it. An incredibly small city between Birmingham and London. There's the expansion of the city of Oxford over time, 1750, 1830, 1900, 1939. Somebody was talking earlier about how old houses last longer. They don't. It's just the only ones we see are the ones that have lasted a long time. Most old houses were very poorly built, particularly by Victorians who built slums. But the fascinating thing is watching the development completely stop at the end of the 1970s. As a result of enacting that plan in the 1940s, you stop in the 1970s, tiny bit of, you can just about see below the bottom of the Northern Gateway and Barton Park on that last 2021. But it really is a city straitjacketed. And politically it fits with the beginning of growing inequality in Britain. Actually fits with 1979 onwards, which may not be a coincidence. A disproportionate number of our prime ministers and ministers spent their youthful days in this city, and I think have had rose-tinted glasses about what fun it was to jump into the Charwell. But they are a small proportion of Oxford residents, and their memories are not as important as the lives of most people in the city. Bikes are old. Bikes are older than cars. Bikes are historic. What is new about Oxford is the amount of traffic. Even in the 1960s, Oxford was called the city of screaming tyres because of the traffic. The traffic is absolutely appalling. It is far worse than it used to be. You can hear it out there on one of the quietest roads. But walking within the city, even though so much of it is 20 miles an hour, the most dangerous aspect of living in Oxford is still cars. I'm going to show you some cycling rates. I'm very used to these maps. You'll have to get used to them very quickly. This is the south of England stretched by population, so that we worry about where people are. That's London. Here's Oxford, tiny little city squeezed between Birmingham and London. And I'm going to show you where the highest proportions of people cycle. 2011 census. Highest proportions in the south are Cambridge, historic. Inner London, historic. Oxford, historic. Not so historic down on the docks. Bristol, fairly historic in the middle. It's interesting that cycling has risen up in the historic centres. It used to be the form of transport most used by the working class. Hull had the highest rate of cycling. It's now a middle class form of transport. It's a form of transport you have to use. It doesn't make much sense for most people who do cycle in Oxford not to cycle, because they don't have space to park a car, and it would often take you longer to drive than it takes to cycle or use the bus. Rates are boring, but that's the list of the highest rates for anybody who's interested. I just thought it was interesting that so many of the historic cities come up in this list. Here's the change. So the blue areas have had an increase in cycling. Now overall we've had an increase in cycling in the UK, but that's only due to London, Cambridge, Oxford, Bristol, Exeter, another historic city, and down I think Brighton on the south coast. Most of the country is seeing fewer and fewer people cycle, because you stop cycling when you're going to finally afford that second-hand or third-hand car, and you don't let your children cycle now. Because even though roads are a little bit safer than they used to be, every other threat to children has almost disappeared in this country. Childhood leukemia is almost gone, which is why we worry about our kids. And I'm going to get on to this in a minute. I won't show you the changing rates. Well, they're there, but I won't go through them. The north of England. Okay, you've learnt the map? Very quick. And Scotland. The cycling capital of the north is York. There's Hull, still high but declining, and Edinburgh. I think you can make a link between history and the resurgence of cycling, and it could be done usefully. The thing this city was never designed for were cars. And once you accept that, once you begin to accept that the city was not designed for cars, there's a way forward. The reason for harking on about this, if you're actually interested in livability and housing, is if you were to build 30,000, 60,000 new units, even at high density, beautifully designed, if you don't make it easier to move around the city, you're just going to make the traffic jams even worse. And the traffic jams really are bad. I have not yet reacclimatised to them. I've come back just over 3 years ago. I'm still shocked to find myself, when I do occasionally drive, sitting at times you cannot predict and not moving. And it's only going to get worse. All of the north, even York, but especially around Hull, cycling is going away. There's a county plan. I'm sure somebody here was probably involved in it and might get insulted in a minute. I'm not meaning to insult you. It has wonderful words about visionary cities such as Copenhagen and Amsterdam, and then it has no vision like that whatsoever for Oxford in it. It has some pictures of people cycling, admittedly on a dirt track you would never want to cycle on in the countryside, and I'll show you later the kind of track you would want to cycle on in the countryside from South Yorkshire that already exists. There are 13 pages about cycling in the report, 71 pages of buses, and then there's a bit about cars, which I think is the highest expenditure, kind of hidden away in the report. The report said we should get cycle premium routes. It said we should have another one already, another 3 by 2016-17, and 3 more by the end of 2017-18. I will carry on saying this in Oxford until 2018, and then I'll change my slides and say they didn't happen. Maybe one kind of route down south will be declared one. The kind of thing we do get in Oxford, things have got better. There are cycle paths on pavements now. Coming back, being away for 30 years, you do see improvements. And this is better than Cambridge. Cycling from Cambridge station into town is just deadly. But these are supposed to be 2 clever cities. And putting that as on your major entrance to the city is just a cry for help. That's the way I put it. It's a cry for help. You sit there on a bike on your own. I do this regularly because I cycle to the station, and you see the cars coming into you and they have to readjust the wheel so they don't hit you. Now I know transport planners know a lot more than me about transport, but they don't know about other things. This is where I would put the cycle premium routes in this city. It is the cheapest possible thing you could do. I'm sure this will happen within 30 years. I'd just like to see it happen within 10 years. The London Road, I'll go through this fast because I guess, how many of you know Oxford? So I've got an idea. Put your hands up if you think you know Oxford, about half, okay. Apologies to those who don't. That's London Road. Oxford's nice and simple. We've named our roads idiot-proof, right? It's called London Road because it goes to London. So all you do is you say that you can only, if you've got a motor, go to London on it. You can't come the other way. That leaves enough room for 4 lanes of bikes on that road. The London Road is still the most dangerous road in Oxford when 2 buses pass each other and you're on a bike. You come in off the Iffley Road, conveniently it comes from Iffley Village, and you can't go out on the Iffley Road if you've got a motor. It creates a loop, frees up space on the road for bikes. You go down the Abingdon Road towards Abingdon. I told you it really is easy. And you come in on the Botley Road from Botley, and again it's a loop. Right pain if you happen to be down on the Abingdon Road and you just want to go 200 metres north in a car. For some reason you'll have to go all the way round. But again it frees up space. It halves the amount of traffic on your major arterial roads. And the last 2, the one we're on here, we're on the Banbury Road. You come in from the Banbury Road, you go out on the Woodstock Road. That's been highlighted for years and stopped by influential members of the old elite in Oxford who love the bus now because they're too old to drive, which is nice to watch when your elite do love buses. I've left the middle blank. At some point the middle is going to have to increasingly pedestrianise. You cannot have that increase towards 13 million people from 7 million coming from the shopping centre, let alone the 2, 3, 4 or 5-fold increase in tourists that this city should expect to get, because it's a second-tier city and we're getting more tourists worldwide. And the pound's dropped by 20%. It's a cheap holiday. We're going to get more tourists. We should be very grateful we're going to get more tourists because, again, it's better than selling missiles to Saudi Arabia, letting people see the Bodleian. It's something you can be more proud of, and we have to do something. So a series of loops. Cowley Road goes to Cowley. Doesn't fit the number of loops because it's the 7th road. Every part of it needs to be accessible by car because people are disabled, but you shouldn't be able to easily get in or out to the Cowley Road car or a bus, I'd say, which is the end of the number 1, which is maybe the most controversial thing. Although I don't know how many people here in this room use the number 1 bus. No. So largest part of Oxford, least represented. How you present it is like this. This is the centre of Sheffield. This is the map that's used in Sheffield. You may not be able to see it. Little black line there, little black line there. Tiny little one-way arrows. That's inside the middle of the city of Sheffield, where I'd lived for 10 years before coming to Oxford. Drive into Sheffield any way, and you have to drive out again that way. You can get into Sheffield with a car, but you have to go out again that way. It's very cleverly designed, so you don't have people coming in and cutting through the city. And inside the middle, most people are on bikes or walking, or on the tram. I won't say any more about trams, because I'm sure you've heard about trams. Oxford used to have a tram. Very obviously, there is space for a tram. Trams are very expensive, many hundreds of times more expensive than simply repainting the road signs and saying one way to traffic. I'm not against trams, it's just I think trams are harder to do, and of course trams can only go to where the trams go. And there are people who live all across the city who could increasingly need to move. That's what the NETA plan looks like. It was published, I think, in the newsletter of the Oxford Civic Society, I think, a couple of months ago. Now again, you make the arrows small where they don't look so frightening. You put some gates across the roads in Cowley Road. You can get everywhere, but it's a right pain. And you put a sign like this, 2 cycles going one way, so the cycle can overtake each other. It's like Copenhagen. Somebody else can worry about whether you put a little raised brick or not. There are experts who've done PhDs on the little raised bricks in the road. Cars go one way, 2 cycles going the other on the other side of the road, and a motorised scooter as well. It's as impossible as pedestrianising Cornmarket was 40 years ago. Starts off as being impossible, becomes desirable, gets proposed, is opposed, is adopted. Just a question of how long it takes. How long before Broad Street is actually empty of traffic so you can have the thousands of tourists milling around in it, with bikes going between them, hopefully at just 3 miles an hour? Yeah, it'll happen at some point. The longer we take, the less money we'll make from tourists. Now, why would you do this? What's the reason? Let's imagine we have a Prime Minister who grew up in Oxfordshire, who decides that she really wants every child to have a grammar school. How can we make sure that every child has a grammar school? She went to a grammar school, it's now called Wheatley Park, it became a comprehensive. How could every child have a grammar school in Oxford? There's only one way. Well, there's 2 ways. The fun way is you recreate the old county grammar. Lovely new building, best school building in Oxford, at the Oxford Academy. We could make it into a grammar school, and the children from North Oxford could try and make their way all the way down to it each morning. Then you would get this plan enacted very, very quickly. But the other way you could create a grammar school for Oxford is you make all of the 5 major secondaries a single school, just one senior management team. We never used to have senior management teams when I was growing up here. Instead of having 5, you have 1, you have 5 sites. 1 site is a 6th form, 1 is the science block, 1 does languages and drama, but the children need to move to a different site every day from across the city. Pie in the sky, Oxford has the biggest educational inequalities, I think, of any city in Europe. Partly because, not just because of the academy doing badly, that's the 28% GCSE pass rate. You just have to walk, I think, 50 yards this way to begin to see the reason. 1/3 of children go private in the city. A friend of mine was just producing a report about why comprehensives are better than grammars and secondary moderns, and she's taking Hampshire and other counties and showing that children do better than where there are grammars. She was going to pick Oxfordshire, didn't work. Can't use Oxford secondaries to say that grammars don't work because of the private. If you don't know, Oxford Academy, 28% passes. Gregory the Great, which is a Catholic school, 47%. Spires, 58%. Cheney, 59%. Only school not to change its name in the last 30 years. It's not quite like Liverpool Riverside and Liverpool Toxteth for Windscale, and nuclear power stations, but it's interesting to note that schools felt they needed to change their names. Cheney, as far as I know, has not published its GCSE results this year. All is not well in Cheney. The Charwell, that's the name change. My mini life's ambition is to watch the go from Charwell. I'll try and take the mickey over the next 10 years enough to get rid of the in front of the Charwell. Not brilliant, 72% GCSE passes, and that's the Tatler recommended comprehensive of Oxford. And finally, and not officially in the city, Matthew Arnold. Now, supposing you ever did want to use those sites in such a way that children and teachers would move around the sites during the week, which gets rid of the stigma, which affects the house prices of North Oxford, you have to make Oxford safe to cycle around. I start off with children because it's relatively easy to understand why you want to make transport safe for children. But you just as much want to make transport safe for elderly people, you just as much want to make it safe for disabled people, and you want to make it safe for tourists who've got no idea that you cycle on the left-hand side of the road, including many of our new students, which you'll discover if you live in this city in a few weeks' time as they cycle towards you, looking confused about what on earth you're doing cycling on the wrong side of the road, which is just what we do. It's just one example. You're never going to solve Oxford's highly divided education system unless you move the children around. You could do a lottery, but the children still have to move around, or you could move them around in a sensible way. And if you were to do this, because of the efficiencies, putting all the science teachers in one block, you could, in a kind of mini utopia, create a state secondary school in Oxford. Doesn't cost more than what we currently have, which is better than what we currently have, which then sucks children out of the private schools, because the bottom half of private schools in Oxford are actually pretty abysmal, and you're not really allowed to say that, but it's a very divided. Here's one, not that abysmal, very selective, in the middle. You would need a hub site for this to work. Don't tell Magdalene, but it's fairly obvious where the hub is. And of course you'd have to make the plane safe for cycling, which is a bit of a waste of that money spent just doing it up recently. But it's just trying to give you an idea. Cycling is affected to education, cycling is affected to housing, cycling affects the amount of tourism you have and whether you can get your tourists out of playing Harry Potter in Christchurch and spread them about a little bit further. Every college in Oxford can have a different mixing hat as well. Just needs JK to agree. There's lots and lots of things you can do, but if you don't address the transport, all the other ideas don't work. Finally, you've got all these cycles in the city, you've got all these people cycling already, they don't leave. They don't leave the city, so how could they get out? This costs a bit more, but it doesn't cost as much as building a new north-south highway, which is hidden in that county structure plan, and this new road link over the Thames. Because what planners really want, what transport planners really want, is more space for cars. It's just they've learned to hide it in the bottom of their plans. Those blue dotted lines, you can hardly see them. That's the planned new road. This is all designed to make George Monbiot's 60th birthday really good, because George would love to see road protesters back in the county. He can remember when he used to do it. Now, you either go for a kind of Los Angeles model of more and more driving, building out in the countryside as we're doing, or you go for a historic model and say we will actually expand this city a little bit, but only within cycling distance. We will not give you car parking spaces, and that stops the urban sprawl, and it's green, and eventually you shouldn't have 40,000 people driving over the Greenbelt. You can be non-green and support the existing Greenbelt, or you can be green and take a chip into the Greenbelt. I stood with a reporter a couple of weeks ago on fields 250 metres north of the John Radcliffe Hospital. It's one of the biggest hospitals in Europe. Any guess about how much use the hospital's going to have in 10, 20, 30 years' time? We had a baby boom in 1946. Right? The amount of business for these hospitals is going to rise, and you can stand in fields 250 metres away from the hospital and lament the fact that a nurse cannot afford to pay the rent in Oxford. It doesn't feel very clever. Out of Oxford. Peak District, lots of ex-railways, loads of cycle routes into the countryside. It's very nice, teach your kids to cycle, go and do something at the weekend that doesn't involve using a car. That's my little play, designed to get somebody to have a better go at saying where would you actually put cycle routes out of Oxford. They're away from the roads, so they're nice. They're fairly direct to places like Bicester, so that a few young people who are particularly green and energetic could actually get in that way, or from this little airport here. Somebody might decide to build some houses on that little airport. Yep. Then imagine if you could just cycle there. There's a Safeway over here. Got a couple of bridges. We've built lots of bridges in the middle of Oxford. There's a bridge in Pembroke College that takes you over an alleyway, so you don't have to mix the hoi polloi. That costs hundreds of thousands of pounds. There's another little bridge to allow the boys from Magdalen School to get to their park without having to mix with normal people. But there isn't a bridge to Barton Park. We can afford bridges for some children, not for other children. Anyway, that's where I would put them. It's not mainly for long distance commuters. It's to allow people to actually go out into the Greenbelt and enjoy the Greenbelt. Because you don't get to see the 2,000 lakes in this county. You don't have access. And to get access, you need a way to get to it. Why was the Greenbelt put in? What was the official excuse? Around about 1948. All these tashed areas are the areas not to be allowed to build on the original plan. The reason was the land is liable to flood, which of course doesn't apply to most of it. And these are northern slopes and broken ground, areas that cannot economically be supplied with the following services: sewerage, water, electricity or gas. That's why we have our current Greenbelt. That is the rationale, right? Because it wasn't until the 1960s that most of rural Oxfordshire actually got gas. It actually got electricity in some cases. But that was the rationale. The real rationale, of course, was snobbishness. The university hated the car plant. The car plant is no longer a threat. But we could lose the car plant. There's only 3,000 people working there. And it could go. BMW threatened before the vote it could go. The car plant is partly there because half of the men, it's almost all men, who work in the car plant are working on the last non-robotic line, and they're from Eastern Europe. So if we say people from Eastern Europe can't come, we can't have a car plant. I won't talk about speeding fines. You can say I have a dislike of cars, and this is the countryside. But currently the plans for the expansion of Oxford are, in effect, we will expand county towns, we will expand villages. You can see we even have trailer parks in Oxfordshire now. They're obviously trailer parks. And everybody will use the car, and they will come and clean our offices and work in this city, and then they'll disappear by car again. Because we have a different attitude to cars than they have in other countries. I spent some time recently in the city of Bern in Switzerland. In Bern there were over 20 railway platforms, and it's a smaller town than Oxford because you use the train, you do not drive unless you have to. And in the middle of Bern there's a tower block. It's over 25 stories high in the middle of this historic city, which is reserved for very elderly people who are near to death because it's near to the hospital. And they live in apartments in this tower block looking out over this beautiful city. And so they have, if you like, a protected view. It's just such a different way of thinking to our way of thinking, where we protect views that nobody can see. In Switzerland, they build housing to allow people who are most likely to spend the longest time looking out of a window to see a nice view. The fines get really big. This is a German footballer. I'm only putting this up just as an example about how different things and behaviour is not very far away in Europe. And back to the 1927 plan. I don't think we'll get anything like this until we have a national government that doesn't have a particular relationship with the city of Oxford based on what happened to them when they were 18, 19 and 20 in that city. But I do think that when we actually have to really worry about the money, and when we can't have schemes that cost an enormous amount, and when we find that the price of petrol is too high for us, then we will begin to build around the edge of the city. Then we will work out ways to encourage cycling, to make it safe for our children to cycle, to slow the cars down, to slow the number of complicated junctions. And people will say it is obvious, just as today when you look at Cornmarket, you don't believe that that street was full of buses when I was a teenager fighting a bus war. And when I was a very young child, that street had cars on it. And people said, you have to have cars on that street because otherwise how will people get from here to here? It is very hard to imagine change. I think we're very likely to get change because we're not a rich enough country to be able to afford to turn Oxford into the equivalent of Windsor and fossilise it and not do anything much with it. We just don't have enough money to be able to do that. Thank you very much.